Hello, and thank you for watching Champion Brief's video topic analysis. I'm Daniel Shatzkin, the editor-in-chief of Champion Brief's Lincoln Douglas products, and today I'm really excited to talk to you about the November-December 2025 topic resolve. The United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land. When we talk about rewilding, we're not just talking about animals or forests. We're talking really about how humans have shaped and reshaped the North American landscape over long periods of time. The idea that nature should be left alone is actually something that's quite new in Western society, especially when it comes to industrialized society. For most of history, human beings and the natural world were inseparable. We were intertwined in systems of reciprocity and care. Humans would care for the land would then provide resources for people to use, whether it be food, water, whatever it may be, trees to burn for fire and warmth. You name it, humans had a reciprocal and intertwined relationship with our land. To understand modern rewilding and to evaluate really whether the United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land, we really first have to understand how our relationship with nature evolved and what moral frameworks shape our choices and how rewilding today intersects with all these ideas and more, like justice, climate change, cultural restoration. The topics that connect to rewilding are really deep and go a really long way. And you can probably connect a lot of different things to rewilding because of humans' relationship with the land. So let's start here with the first part of the topic analysis, which is kind of the historical landscape of rewilding and how we got to the world we are living in now. So you kind of have the pre-colonial era. And so before European colonization, North America wasn't an untouched wilderness. This concept of, pristine, untouched wilderness is a very colonial mindset that ignores how Native Americans both cared for their ecosystem and interacted with it. In truth, it was a mosaic of ecosystems that were actively managed by these indigenous peoples for thousands of years, whether it was through things like controlled burns, selective hunting, plant cultivation. They actively worked to sustain biodiversity, and they supported keystone species in their regions like bisons, elk, beavers, you name it. Native peoples were very connected with the lands that they lived on. There is evidence that there were periodic fires that were done on the Great Plains, which helped renew the grasses that would feed immense herds of grazers, and today represents kind of the soil in which a lot of American wheat and corn is produced. It's these fertile grass fields in a lot of areas that there's discussion of bringing back. This era though really challenges this like Western colonial myth of pristine wilderness, right? The wilderness in America has not been pristine for, since the first people really got here and started to interact with the land as hunter-gatherers. But indigenous stewardship was itself a sophisticated ecological system, and it's rooted really in reciprocity with the land, i.e., people treat the land well, and the land will then treat people back well. Nature wasn't really a thing to be conquered, it was a relative. It's part of a spiritual and moral network for most Native societies in the Americas. Modern rewilding increasingly looks back to this knowledge, recognizing that ecological balance and cultural respect go hand in hand. And we'll come back to some of the controversy with the term rewilding, and then going back to this time of more indigenous stewardship later, and why the term itself may be problematic in what it is trying to relate. But for now, understand that generally speaking, the earliest time periods that rewilding talks about is the arrival of humans into the ecosystem, and basically the earliest human interactions. Obviously, there were mass extinctions that occurred post-human arrival into the Americas, from the mammoth and the saber-toothed tiger to much smaller species like the passenger pigeon, and other countless other species that have gone extinct in the Americas, due mainly to human interaction. So the next key kind of time period, though, that we go to is the colonial frontier expansion time period, and that's like the 1600s through like the early 1800s. So, when settlers were coming into the country and then expanding across the country mostly. European colonization was functionally like an ecological just upheaval. Settlers cleared forests that had existed for, thousands and thousands of years, ancient forests. They used the timbers to build houses, ships. They cleared the land to provide for farming and livestock area. They plowed prairies and turned it into managed farms. They were hunting for profit. So you had early trappers, French trappers and beaver trappers and stuff like that, that would function a lot in northern Canada and in the wilderness in the Americas. And down the Mississippi River, French trappers are kind of a stereotypical historical display with their beaver hat. But they hunted for profit. They also introduced a lot of different livestock species, specific cattle species that weren't here. They were invasive species, and they basically turned land that may have been managed, but was not really actively farming and used for agriculture in the same way of industrialized agriculture that was beginning to rise during this period. The American bison, millions and millions of bison, basically are nearly exterminated during American expansion. And it begins during this period and continues on through the 1900s. You have wolves, cougars, and bears that were hunted in different areas to almost extinction in most of their ranges. And a range is just the area in which an animal kind of covers and where they will be present. Like I said before, the passenger pigeon, which was once one of the most abundant birds in North America, was gone ultimately by 1914. And it all starts during the 19th century, the 1800s, but honestly earlier in the 1600s and pushing through. But ultimately by that 19th century, in the 1800s, the continent's ecosystem were completely fragmented, and you had farms that were breaking apart, ranges of animals that were wild herding animals like bison. You had wolves and cougars and bears that were being hunted because they would cause problems for the farmers, and so like wolves notoriously and cougars were completely eradicated from a lot of the ranging and grazing lands of American cattle, because they would harm the cattle industry. This destruction, though, started to give rise to the first stirrings of the conservation movement. And you get naturalists like John James Audubon, who will definitely has problematic elements about him. I am not going to defend all of John James Audubon's views. You can look them up for yourself if you're really curious. He has some problematic views. I will not deny that. But what he does for the conservation movement is he really starts documenting species loss and setting a moral stage for ecological responsibility. that starts to carry through into the early conservation era that we see beginning in the late 1800s. And that's our next time period, which is the late 1800s and early 1900s. And this period marks the birth of what would be called like an organized conservation movement, where there were actual figures who were really pushing for conservation and different ecological movements. Now, again, in modern times, we look back on a lot of these people, and they definitely have some problematic modern views, but we should look at these people comparatively to their times. And while, yes, there are problematic perspectives from people like, John Muir, for example, he had some very problematic views on minorities. There were still valid conservation opinions that they were promoting that we should look at as something that's important for the history of it. Doesn't take away from any of the racist things that some of these people may have viewed or sexist things that they may have viewed. But we should look at the totality of their views and not, deny truth to one element because another element is incredibly problematic. If the truth is still true, the problematic element doesn't necessarily take away from that truth. It just means that we have to acknowledge the fact that these people were problematic, but they promoted a truthful idea. So I already mentioned Muir. Another figure is Gifford Pinchot. I may have said his name wrong. And then you also have Theodore Roosevelt, notably, who establishes national parks and stuff like that. Muir promotes a vision, and oftentimes, by the way, these visions were very competing. Muir looked at nature for spiritual preservation. Or spiritual preservationism, depending on where you read it. And this idea is functionally the concept of preserving the land as it is in a spiritual connection to the land. It would probably be more akin to the rewilding efforts of today than, say, Pinchot's, actually, I think it's Pinchot, not Pinochet. Pinchot's wise use idea, which is basically like we should preserve some nature, but we should also like understand that we need to use some of the nature for our own kind of purpose. And then you have Roosevelt's kind of pragmatic stewardship method, which is very similar to Pinchot's wise use, but really also looks at kind of Muir's preservationist perspective and says that we need to be able to use the land, but we also should preserve the land for future generations, and future generations should be able to enjoy America's natural beauty. And that's really what starts to come around in the late 1800s. You have Yellowstone becoming the world's first national park in 1872. U.S. Forest Service follows and it's founded in the early 1900s, and then the National Park Service is founded a little bit later, and they take different roles. The U.S. Forest Service manages forest lands, and some of those lands are available for commercial use, whereas the Park Service really manages only the lands that are national parks and set aside for national parks, and keeps those lands accessible for people. Generally, Forest Service lands are less managed than Park Service lands. Forest Service lands tend to be more wild than Park Service lands, and it's just Park Service lands are meant to be more accessible, whereas some of the actual Forest Service lands are meant to maintain that wildness. But these early efforts really sought to preserve, ultimately, what we had left. They were not designed really to restore what was already lost. And you got to remember, by this point, the Industrial Revolution is well in gear. There's a lot of pollution, a lot of land that's been torn up and turned into all sorts of different farms and all different uses. But they really did do some big work. They ended up saving species like bison from extinction, and they established a precedent in this time that government could and should protect the natural world. And so, the reason why bison exists today is because of a concerted effort from some of these conservationists at this time to say we need to protect bison. And they managed small populations of bison and grew them into larger herds. And well, today bison are not technically a wild species, they're really managed herds. There is still the effort to allow them then to roam wild. Uh, in going beyond that into like the 1930s through kind of the 1970s ish, you start to see this new scientific language of ecology come to the forefront and really studied. During the Great Depression, you have the Civilian Conservation Corps that was founded. One of the actions that they did was they planted a lot of forests and they did soil restoration efforts throughout the Midwest. You have the Dust Bowl, right? The Dust Bowl is basically the process of the soil being so degraded through crop growing that they could blow, winds would just blow the soil away into these massive dust storms. And again, these are these grasslands and prairie lands that for generations and generations and generations, thousands of years, were productive farmlands. The only difference between European management of these grasslands and native management of these grasslands is Europeans constantly produced on these lands, whereas native producers, because one, smaller populations, but two, being much more, uh, you know, uh, relational outlook towards nature, they often would, prevent soil depletion from happening in different areas and would rotate the crops around. So 20th century, you get groups like the Civilian Conservation Corps who were engaged in actions to restore soil, plant forests. You have people like Aldo Leopold, who wrote Land Ethic, right? And that teaches, or Leopold's perspective functionally was that a thing is right when it preserves the integrity, stability, and the beauty of the biotic community. And so it's those three elements, right? Just because you may preserve the beauty, if the environment isn't stable or, it's broken up, it is not necessarily a right thing to do ethically, according to people like Leopold, who was, notable early conservationist. Later on, you have figures like Rachel Carson, who wrote a book called Silent Spring, and that talked a lot about dangers of pesticides, and it actually kind of spurs the modern environmentalist movement that starts to take rise in the 60s and 70s and stuff like that. The 1960s, you get the Wilderness Act. I don't remember the exact year. It's like the mid 60s, and then you also get the Endangered Species Act in 1973. And notably, these are two pieces of law that were signed by presidents of different parties. Right, in '64, you're dealing with Johnson, a Democrat. In 73, you're dealing with Nixon, a Republican. It's notable because at this time, there was actually a bipartisan drive to protect nature, protect the beauty of America and some of our most important species. Obviously, there were still differences of opinion back then, but there was much more of a bipartisan unity in Congress to protect America's natural world. Rewilding, though not yet really named, kind of begins here. It's the recognition of the web of relationships and not just individual parts within nature. And so each individual in nature is not just a collection. It's not one group here and one group there. everything is interrelated. And if you hurt nature in one area, you're going to hurt it in another. And the two things will always come back together in this interrelated web. And so that's where we start to get to this modern rewilding movement that begins in the 1980s. In the 90s, conservation biologists Michael Sewell, I'm definitely pronouncing that name wrong. It's Soule. Definitely pronouncing that name wrong, and I apologize for that. But him and Reed Norse basically popularized the kind of concept of, or Reed Noss rather, these three C's: cores, corridors, and carnivores. Basically, it was a very simple concept. Bring back apex predators like wolves and bears, cougars, stuff like that. Reconnect the landscapes, and then allow the ecosystems to self-regulate within these core environments that could then spread out. So the core basically is where you're trying to begin the rewilding effort, and then you allow it to spread out. So some of the examples that occurred were like the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone in 1995. Wolves have now also been reintroduced into the Rocky Mountains with some issues. That was a very recent development within Colorado, but wolves are trying to be reintroduced. And what happened was they found a lot of success. The wolves would reduce the elk populations, and the elk then weren't destroying as many trees and shrubs because that's what they would feed off of. So the trees and shrubs were allowed to rebound. So the forests themselves were much healthier. And that actually supported a bunch of other species like beavers and birds, and a generally healthier river environment because beavers actually help the river, so do birds. And so then what you now have is projects like the Wildlands Network or the American Prairie. And they're trying to extend the visions to connect habitats across different areas in the continent. And so, species that live in the grasslands during one time of the year, but may move to the mountains during warmer time of the year, or, whatever it may be, connecting those habitats so that species can actually move and migrate as they're supposed to, and have much more natural migration patterns that are less affected by people, and therefore their species are much safer. It also really isn't just about wildlife and flora and fauna. It's also about climate resilience today. We talk about a lot of how healthy ecosystems can capture carbon. They're really important. Strong tree networks and stuff like that can help buffer against mudslides. Beaver dams and things like that can actually control the flows of rivers and help buffer against floods and slow down floodwaters. And so sustaining biodiversity is really an important element for the entirety of the ecosystem. Moreover, rewilding also talks about integrating social justice and collaboration with those indigenous nations and the recognition of an ecological debt and shared stewardship that we're in with society. And so that kind of brings us now to our resolution. And that's resolved the United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land. And to me, rewild, we'll get into more of that in a minute, but the really kind of key term to me in the topic is substantial. What does that mean? It's really just an inherently vague term, unfortunately. Substantial can refer to size, it can refer to scope, it can refer to significance. Usually in debate, we kind of refer substantial to mean, large enough to matter. But what does that actually mean? How do we prove a piece of land is a substantial rewilding? And how much rewilding then is enough to transform ecosystems meaningfully? And there also becomes this question of jurisdiction, right? Much of the land that we talk about for rewilding is federally controlled land, like national forests and grasslands. Bureau of Land Management land, National Forest Service lands, National Park Service lands, all of that. Yet a lot of it could also overlap with some of those indigenous territories and state territories. And so any policy that you are kind of discussing, you need to make sure that you're discussing it on federal lands. State policies are great empirical examples about how rewilding may work. Indigenous policies, the same, but they should be federally managed lands. And some of those indigenous lands are actually co-managed by the indigenous people in Bureau of Land Management. And so you need to be really clear about what the lands are that you are talking about within your speeches. Finally, there's the word ought. Usually we look at ought as signaling a moral obligation, not just what is practical, but what is right. And that brings us kind of to the heart of the debate. Why ought we to rewild? And that's where we start to get kind of into our ethical framework kind of discussion. So to start out, I'll begin with arguments, utilitarianism, basic cost benefit analysis kind of framework. Utilitarianism, ethics of consequences, will ask us to maximize overall happiness or minimize suffering or preserve as much life as possible. From a utilitarian perspective, rewilding could be only justified if it creates more benefit than harm, right? That's that cost benefit analysis. So, for example, if we can prove that rewilding can improve climate stability better than other methods, or it preserves biodiversity the best, and it enhances human well-being, and preserving biodiversity is, you impact that to something big. That's how you kind of prove a util af on this topic. But the problem with util is that it treats nature instrumentally. Basically, nature is valuable insofar as it serves human happiness. And that means that there's basically like an anthropocentric argument against a lot of these util claims, because critics will argue that it misses the point and that ecosystems have intrinsic value in and of itself. And so even within util reasoning, the long-term benefits of ecological stability often will outweigh those short-term economic costs. So if we cut away, suddenly we're not getting as much oil, right? The short-term economic costs of that could be outweighed by long-term ecological stability. You just have to prove where, human happiness is best served. Or, moreover, extend it beyond that and say that util actually applies to all species, and improving the ecosystem for all benefits. And that's what we should be looking at. And human benefits are secondary to, overall well-being of the entire environment. Strategically, util does tend to favor the negative, I think, because of a lot of the immediate human harms. Think job loss, rural displacement, resource loss, food. We could have food loss, water wars, all sorts of different resource impacts that come along with this on the negative. But the affirmative really needs to spin the topic in terms of ecological survival, right? All of those short-term harms can actually be solved, but long-term ecological survival is something that needs to be addressed. The rural displacement can be solved. We can get homes built. Reduced resource access can be solved. We can, technology can make the lands that we're using more efficient, and we can produce better food through like GMOs on smaller plots of land and allow more land to be rewilded. Also, there's some argument that says that like processes like agroecology actually are better producers and allows for rewilding of plots of land within farms, all sorts of different stuff. But the affirmative really will have to say that, like, functionally, the economy can't thrive on a planet that's dying. And if the planet will die without the AF, it doesn't matter any of the other harms. The planet dying is the ultimate impact because no species survives. Uh, Beyond util, you get to other authors. There's Deontology, Kantian ethics, which focuses more on the moral duty and respect for rational beings. Traditionally, Kant's framework is very anthropocentric, i.e., very human focused, and only looks at humans as beings that can be valued as an end unto themselves. But there are a lot of modern Kantians, for example, uh, Toby Laboda, I want to say, argues that we have what would be called an imperfect duty to protect the environment because harming it undermines basically our own moral agency. And yeah, they go into it in much greater detail, but functionally, the environmental harm uh, forces us into decisions that are potentially immoral, and we'll have no choice to do them because of environmental degradation and stuff like that. And so we have to protect the environment in order to protect uh, basically an atmosphere where we can act within our own moral agencies. Uh, so in that Kantian framework, rewilding then becomes a moral obligation because failing to respect nature's integrity can also degrade human dignity. And so that you then get into like the categorical imperative, act only according to the maxim which you can will to be universal law. And that would probably condemn reckless exploitation of the environment. And so it would be up to the affirmative to prove that there is this duty to prevent the reckless exploitation then of the environment, and rewilding prevents that. Deontology generally is a very powerful argument because it talks more specifically about our duties in the world rather than the consequences of the actions resulting from those duties. So if destroying the ecosystem violates our duty to respect life, the economic convenience of continuing this system of environmental destruction just isn't worth it, and it's not justifiable. And so inaction isn't justifiable for economic convenience. We have to have this ecosystem that is present and livable. Moving on from deontology, you get things like virtue ethics. Virtue ethics on this topic, I think, is an interesting argument because there are a lot of different ways to approach it. So, virtue ethics is rooted basically in Aristotle, and it asks not what should we do, but what kind of people should we be, and what kind of actions would those people take. So rewilding would then express virtues like maybe humility or care, temperance, maybe, you know, uh, responsibility. You can come up with a lot of different ideas. And then so to rewild would be to recognize our limits, and to practice restraints and to live with nature and rather than controlling it. There's a philosopher, Rosalind Hursthouse, and they argue that environmental virtue lies in cultivating respect and wonder for life. And so rewilding really isn't about control, it's about character and showing that respect and wonder for the life of the natural world. So ecological restoration then becomes really a moral restoration, a character restoration for society. Going beyond kind of Western ideals, you have some Eastern philosophy that kind of starts to pop up. And from like a Taoist lens, there's the principle of Wu Wei, or non-action. And that probably fits the concept of rewilding really nicely. Because like Wu Wei doesn't mean doing nothing. Right? Non-action isn't about uh, not doing anything. It's acting in harmony with the natural flow of events. And so rewilding would function as an act of non-action because it's stepping back so that natural processes can resume their course, but it's actually an action in and of itself. Right? Non-action is still an action because you are taking that action of stepping back and acting in harmony. So you're not doing nothing. You are literally stepping back and allowing nature to re uh, assert itself in the world. Uh, Through rewilding, basically, humanity withdraws its grasp, which would then allow the Tao, the self ordering principle of nature, to restore balance. And it's an ecological manifestation of humility and balance that is aligned with Taoist principles. I think this would be a really interesting case for people who are kind of interested in the spiritual nature of rewilding. There are a lot of different spiritual concepts of rewilding and how it affects the human conscious and the human being. And I think this is just an interesting kind of concept to explore further, even if you don't want to turn it into an argument. I think just understanding different perspectives on the world beyond Western society is a really important part of debate and why we engage in these conversations. Going back though to Western society, kind of on the opposite end of Kantianism is Hobbes and the social contract. Uh, Hobbes might actually oppose rewilding because Hobbes basically believed that the sovereign's duty is to protect the people from the chaos of nature, from the state of war that life in the wild it represents. So rewilding in Hobbesian logic really risks returning us to the chaos of the state of nature and relinquishing control over the state of nature that Hobbes actually focuses on as being like a way to protect people. And you can kind of see that with like this clash of security and freedom of nature that could occur with like predator species, apex predators, and threatening ranchers and rancher well-being. Wolves in the Rockies have had a couple of predations. You have cougars that kill cows and other livestock and stuff like that. And so the Hobbesian perspective might say that like relinquishing control from nature is actually immoral. And that the state is supposed to control nature. So, do we value security or freedom for nature? And the resolutions ought in this way forces us to weigh the moral order against ecological autonomy. And it sets up a really, really fascinating and interesting debate. Uh, and then, if we want to go even further, we can look at more critical and kind of contemporary perspectives. And so, from a decolonial and an indigenous perspective, many scholars view rewilding as kind of a form of decolonial restoration, even if they may have uh, issues with the phrase rewilding itself. The goals of rewilding fit within the goals of decolonial restoration because colonization didn't just seize land, it transformed the meaning of nature, right? Landscapes were literally turned into property. The native peoples of the Americas didn't have the same conceptions of property as Western European colonizers did, and so thinkers like Arturo Escobar, Robin Wall, Kimmerer, I believe, argue that rewilding must begin with this kind of concept of epistemic rewilding, or freeing the thought from the domesticated categories of Western industrialism. Uh, Indigenous scholars don't talk about rewilding. It's not about really removing humans, it's about restoring the relationship. And so that's where you get like the land back kind of movements. Uh, which see the land not as a resource, but really as, you know, another being that we can relate to as like family. And so the reintroduction, say, of like bison by the Intertribal Buffalo Council, or salmon restoration by the Yurok tribe, show kind of how true relational rewilding looks like. It's ecological renewal grounded in sovereignty of the indigenous peoples of that region and the peoples there. Um, Pre-wilding then basically becomes what we would call a moral debt. So it's a form of environmental reparation, um, that the United States would provide, that restores both ecosystems and cultures simultaneously. Because a lot of native cultures were inherently tied to their ecosystems, and the culture and the environment were one and the same in a lot of ways. And the culture shaped the environment, and the environment shaped the culture. It was a symbiotic relationship. And when the environment was destroyed, the culture was destroyed along with it. And so restoring the environment helps to restore the culture. Uh, then there are also, by the way, questions on the term rewilding, because again, there are native cultures that were here and had that symbiotic relationship. And so there are other native scholars that look at the term rewilding and say that the term itself is wrong. It's the wrong term, but the right goals, basically. And using the term rewilding uh, is, you know, erasing kind of the connections that native cultures have. There's also the idea that native cultures themselves weren't wild, right? That's a Western perspective on the indigenous peoples here, that is generally looked at today as being incorrect. They had forms of government and developed societies and communities and all sorts of relations. And while they may not have looked like Western European relations, they were in no way, shape, or form unorganized and, wild. They were real, fully developed societies, and calling a movement rewilding to go back towards that, indigenous relationship with the community, or with nature rather, ignores the fact that these societies were anything but wild, right? They were highly organized, highly developed peoples across, multiple different groups, nations, peoples, um, just all sorts of very, very developed cultures and societies that, while they differed from Western society, they were not wild. Then you get kind of the Black ecological perspective, which kind of takes uh, environmental degradation and links it to kind of racial capitalism that has existed in America. And so you get some authors like Catherine Youssef, who would argue that the American landscape itself is built on the logic of the plantation, the same logic, an ecological system of domination and extraction. Just think about, oil extraction and, logging industries and all of these things. It's about controlling and dominating the environment for human needs. And so it's the same logic on that the plantation was used. It's a system of domination and extraction. And so from this lens, rewilding becomes an abolitionist act, and it's about abolishing the plantation and its environmental formation. It's not just about restoring the land to wildness, but freeing it from this racialized system of control. Uh, I believe their last name is Gumbs, Gumbs. It talks about it in terms of a Black feminist rewilding. I think first name is Alexis. And that's the practice of basically living with non-human kin after catastrophe. And so this view reminds us that wildness, yeah, in quotes, itself has been a racialized kind of idea, and it was used historically to dehumanize Black and Indigenous people, like I just talked about, right? And so to rewild responsibly, we have to first decolonize what that idea of wild actually is. And when we connect wildness to a dehumanizing view of Black and Indigenous peoples, that is irresponsible. And so, first, we have to decolonize that very idea of wild. Then there are also arguments about access to the wilderness and how Black Americans have historically lacked access to the wilderness or had felt unsafe in the wilderness due to like acts like lynching, and historically the wilderness has been a world that has been very much presented as a space of safety for white people, but not necessarily a space of safety for Black people. And so there are a lot of stories about how rewilding the land is actually allowing Black people back to access the land. And so there are a couple of different nuanced perspectives when it comes to race and how we use and look at the land in this country. There's also feminist political ecology. Feminist political ecology critiques rewilding's tendency towards more of like what would be called managerial heroism. So it's basically talking about engineering ecosystems or saving nature, right? We risk reproducing kind of what would be called a patriarchal logic of domination. So a couple of different ecofeminists that you can look at are like Val Plumwood and Maria Puig de la, hold on, I have it here, Bellacasa. And if I pronounce that wrong, I apologize. But a lot of them emphasize the concept of care over control, right? And so when we talk about control of the environment, or kind of a concept of eco-managerialism basically being a problem, and that rewilding is still a form of eco-managerialism. And so from their perspective, true rewilding isn't abandonment of nature, it's cohabitation. So it's not letting nature heal itself while we walk away, but participating in mutual care. And so it's not really a call to dominate or withdraw, but rather to allow nature to nurture us and us to nurture nature. And so it's more of a reconnection spiritually to nature, and healing with nature and nature healing alongside of us, and seeing the problems of domination, as well as acknowledging that we really can't abandon nature because we are inherently connected to nature. And so the nurturing relationship is a closer one to the preferred and healthy relationship or ethical relationship. And then finally, you get to something that would be called like critical animal studies. And critical animal studies questions the anthropocentrism of rewilding itself. And so there are some scholars like Carrie Wolf, and they argue that even our attempts to free nature are still an act of human control, right? That's eco-managerialism. So we decide what counts as wild, where wolves should roam, which species to revive, right? Do we revive the mammoth? Maybe not, but we'll revive the wolf, or we'll bring back the cougar, but we'll only let it back in these lands. So this critique basically warns that rewilding can become a subtle form of domination, right? Humans offering wildness rather than relinquishing it. The challenge is then to rewild ourselves, to step back from the illusion that we can master the environment and embrace the interdependence. And you'll notice that a lot of these critiques talk about the fact that like rewilding is still a form of mastery and not really that interdependent web. And so that's how critiques on this case kind of form. And so, given the complexity, why should we rewild? So, first, there's this crisis of disconnection. You have climate change, you have mass extinction, environmental injustice, all stem basically from the single root of separation of humans from nature, and that rewilding restores ecological processes and redefining our places within them. Second, rewilding could align with justice, not just for animals and ecosystems, but for people. Indigenous led restoration, Black ecological futures, feminist ethics of care can all have a framing of rewilding as a reparative, healing the wounds basically of colonialism, capitalism, and environmental exploitation. And then third are the practical benefits, carbon sequestration, biodiversity recovery, cleaner water, healthy soils, etc. All of those can help as a shared investment in survival. On the flip side, on the negative, you have issues of the problematic nature of the term rewilding itself, and how rewilding can still be a form of eco-managerialism. There's also issues of property rights, and how rewilding may end up having to affect different property, the harms of rewilding different species like apex predators, and whether or not rewilding is actually even successful, right? Can we actually really rewild these species in mass and return grasslands and forests and prairies and savannas to the state they should be, or oceans, or, can we bring back pollinators? Is our problem with different species not necessarily how we use the land or how much land we use, but other impacts like air pollution and pesticides and all sorts of other stuff seep into the ecosystem that even if we rewild substantial tracts of land, they would still be affected by, because the world is interrelated, and maybe this rewilding just doesn't go far enough. Or maybe rewilding just violates individual rights and property rights, whether it's the rights of farmers to use their land as they wish, or their right over a cow that could get killed from a wolf that's been reintroduced, or just the relationship that we have with nature in and of itself, and the fact that we are, trying to own a species and control and dominate nature, even if we want to rewild. In some way, we still have to address that element of our humanity before really we can address nature and solve for nature. And so what does that mean ultimately? Rewilding asks us to imagine more than just new landscapes. It asks us to imagine ultimately new ethics. It's about whether or not we should rebalance power between humans and the living world, and acknowledging that the land is not a backdrop to our history, but a participant really in it. When we reintroduce bison to the prairie or wolves to Yellowstone, we're not really just reintroducing species, we also reintroduce stories that are connected to those species. We're acknowledging that nature remembers and that it can heal, and that we as a society can heal too, and learn some humility from our past. So if whether or not we are affirming or negating the topic on whether or not the United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land, it's not just about policy. We're actually getting to talk about participating in a great work of renewal, about reconnecting to the society and the environment in which we exist, because no one element exists independent of itself. We are all connected in some way, shape, or form to other beings and the environment in which we live in. Whether or not rewilding is the best way forward for humanity and the world and every species in it, that's up to the debates that you engage in. There are a lot of answers ethically, yes or no. But the fact is, this is probably one of the most unique topics that we've had in a very long time that asks us not just a question of policy, but also a question of spirit and how we see humans relating not only to each other, but the land and other species. Thank you for listening. Good luck on your debates, and I hope you learned something.